What are some of the other ways that you found have been helpful or some of the themes that have emerged from some of the storytelling you've heard around managers or things that they've done that has been helpful to folks' experience? I think I remember you earlier on in your explanation opening up, and what I got from what you were saying earlier is that in higher ed, sometimes what's viewed as successful management or leadership is connected to output. What are you producing? That's these some of these like tangible things, and the folks who are geared towards that are seen as successful and can move up in other ways. But I've always thought, Chelsea, I've always thought that there are technical ways of doing work, but then there are also very relational ways of doing work and working together and getting things done that involve identity, acknowledgement of that, involve how are we communicating with one another in terms of transparency and sharing information and those different things. Like the relational pieces that influence the way that output or whatever the thing that is produced eventually gets done. What's the way in which we get there? The things that inform that way. So I've always thought that. But I'm wondering, what are some things that you found or that you've heard in terms of things that are helpful? I know you mentioned checking in and just different other aspects or examples of things that you've heard that would be helpful for some managers to know. These are some helpful things to
Yeah.
do as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe before I go into specifics, I'll just share kind of big picture what my collaborators and I tried to do is
Mhm.
pull together what's a guiding metaphor that we can use for all of these things that we're talking about. And we landed on seeing the supervisory relationship as a garden or as something that's living and breathing that you have to cultivate over time. One aspect of that is the soil. So for us, the soil represented the context that we're all in, or as Beverly Daniel Tatum says, the smog in the air, right? And good supervisors who are taking a trauma conscious and identity conscious approach are aware of the soil that we all are growing in higher
Mhm.
education. So that means being aware that injustice is happening. For supervisees in particular, that could be at all levels of the process of them joining the team. So some of my collaborators talked about ways that even from just submitting their application, they knew things that they were going to experience based on their name, right? Or how that would be perceived, or what stereotypes or associations there would be with that from that first moment. So being aware of what some of those injustices or inequities could be from application to interviewing to hiring to onboarding, all of that is a part of being aware of the soil. But beyond just being aware, it's also important that supervisors are doing what they can to shift and make changes to that soil so that it's more livable for folks, right? And so that brings us to the second part of the metaphor, which is fertilizing the garden. And there are five principles of trauma informed practice: safety, trust, empowerment, collaboration, and choice that we're also applying in this project to supervision by infusing in principles of safety, trust, empowerment, collaboration, and choice into your supervisory relationship. You're inevitably starting to shift and change some of that soil, but it's not instantaneous, just like different plants might need different time to grow, especially if there's an identity differential or power differential, which there usually is in a supervisory relationship. It's not a given that you're going to build that trust straight away.
Mhm.
And we feel that it's on those of us who hold privileged identities, such as being a white person. The onus is on us to do the work to build that trust. It's not something that we can just assume is given to us. And so in my supervisory relationships, I've also seen that it's on me to do the work to model vulnerability or to create that environment of safety and trust, build that over time. In addition to that, though, it's also important to have some ongoing watering and care, right? So you can infuse some of these principles in, but without things like humility, empathy, authenticity, those plants aren't going to grow. Those relationships aren't going to flourish. So my collaborators talked a lot about the importance of reflexivity, or being able to, in a self-aware way, critically look at mistakes that you've made or ways that you could have done differently or better, and acknowledge that openly and share, that actually wasn't my best, or maybe I failed you in this way, or I didn't live up to my own values in this way. Being able to say that really openly, that's a part of what sort of waters the supervisory relationship throughout. And then the final piece is the institutional environment in which supervision takes place. So we call this the greenhouse to call attention to the fact that supervision doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right?
Mm,
Our one on one supervisory relationships are impacted by things like HR policies and practices or institutional leaders. And so that's one thing that was, I think, a positive surprise for me coming out of these conversations is how much we talked about things outside of just supervision that impact supervision. And so the ways that, for example, flexible work policies or the ways that organizations handled remote work during the pandemic
come
or
on.
the ways that in education and in nonprofits, folks are not paid an equitable living wage or
Mhm.
given equitable family leave. Like, all of these things um, impact someone's quality of life and are inherently also trauma informed practices. I think we sometimes think about trauma informed practice as something that we do one on one and how we treat one another, which is important, but it also needs to be systemic. And if we truly care about trauma informed practice or employee well-being, we have to go beyond just saying, oh, we have an employee assistance program that you can call into if you need it. Actually be providing folks with the things that they need to be able to live well. Because I think so often in education and in nonprofits, because we do this work because we love it, we tend to think, oh, we don't need to care so much about the hours that someone's working or what they're getting paid to do it because their passion should be enough.
Mhm.
That's actually an injustice and a disservice to folks and is feeding what now we're calling the Great Recession because there's less of a tolerance for that than there used to be, which I think is actually a good thing.
Yes, yes, I think it's a good thing as well. I think it's a good thing as well. I'm wondering to degrees what learnings or what, experience or takeaways have you all gained to the extent where you've been able to explore supervisory relationships where perhaps the supervisor had some identities that were marginalized in relation to their supervisees and any dynamics that might arise through that dynamic as well? Has that come up so far in some of your stories and experiences?
Yeah. And there's also two really great books that have come out just in the last couple of years that also talk about this concept in a higher education setting. One is called Identity Conscious Supervision, and one is called Inclusive Supervision. And both of them talk specifically about supervisory relationships across identities and experiences. So I would highly recommend them. Those texts don't necessarily focus on trauma, though. That's just not a part of their model. But I think that for me, even though my relationship with my collaborators on the higher education supervision project, that was not a supervisory relationship. I think I used a lot of the principles that I've learned as a supervisor in my relationships with my collaborators. And some of that has been for me humility. So coming to conversations with a acute awareness of everything I do know and cannot know because it's not my lived experience, but also equal parts humility and curiosity and believing that through hearing one another's stories in relationship with one another, change can happen and transformation can happen. And certainly did that in supervisory relationships when, for example, as the director of an LGBT center, there was a lot at my institution that wasn't great for queer trans people and particularly for queer and trans people of color on that campus. And so by having humility and curiosity with my staff and with my students, there was a lot that I learned that needed to shift and change and strategies for how to shift and change it that
Mm,
I'm really grateful for. And it was similar in the higher education supervision project as well, that they had come into this having done some work around the academic side of supervision, but knowing that's just one form of knowledge. There's a lot of other equally or even more valid forms of knowledge that come from our own lived experiences. So having that curiosity has also been a really organizing principle for, I think, how I view all of my relationships is that there's always something that I can learn and gain um, through being in true relationship with others and not that extractive kind of relationship that I think can often happen in
mhm,
research or in other organizations where it's just about what can I get from you rather than what can we be together and what can we learn from one another.
mhm.